How does the hillbilly complicate ideas of race and class, and what does this reveal more largely about how race and class operates in America? The concept of the hillbilly has become one that is instantly recognizable in contemporary culture. Whether it is being satirized on the television or recreated in print, it is an image that not only tells us about those stigmatized with this label, but also about those who use the label. The hillbilly has become a distinct minority group in its own right, but unfortunately it is a group that is often excluded, stereotyped, and repressed in its own way. When looking at the hillbilly's representation in the media, it is clear to see a class difference which leads to the hillbilly being treated differently. This shows that racism and prejudice is not just reserved for pigmentation and skin color, but can also be highly affected by class. By looking at the image of the hillbilly through the lenses of Freud and Enlightenment, we see a possible insight into the root of this prejudice and racism. But first, what is a hillbilly? The term hillbilly first appeared in print in a 1900 New York Journal article. The paper defined a hillbilly as being a free and untrammeled white citizen of Alabama, who lives in the hills, has no means to speak of, dresses as he can, talks as he pleases, drinks whiskey when he gets it, and fires off his revolver as the fancy takes him. From this, the image that we now instantly recognize as a hillbilly grew. Throughout time, it has come to be used as a derogatory term for a select group of people, a group typically associated with America, most notably from the South. This shows the beginning of the repressive nature that comes with the term the hillbilly. The influence of media has portrayed the hillbilly in a very distinct way, most famously Cletus in The Simpsons and Beverly Hillbillies. This all forms the basis for the image that most of us will know well today. In Sigmund Freud's Civilization and Its Discontent, a number of key ideas that can be linked to the hillbilly arise. It is about the large groups, which is the rest of society, getting together to survive, while those who seek a more primitive lifestyle will become repressed and a minority of the progressive society. Freud states that there will be a tension between the civilization and the individuals. Other Freudian ideas are based around the id, ego, and superego. Although there isn't a direct link, it could be assumed that these consciences could be personified as the id representing the hillbillies in the sense of this animalistic and savage image, in a similar way to the portrayal of Native Americans. Much of the basis for Freud's general research is based around the repressed, and this is a perfect example of a society marginalizing the minority. The hillbilly represents the free lifestyle. It represents what can be seen as free will. The image is not susceptible to the rules that society dictates, as so they are seen as different. And as we learn from history, difference always comes with fear, suspicion, and usually ends in rejection. As the New York Journal said, the hillbilly dresses as he can, talks as he pleases. Using this theory, it would be argued that the hillbilly does complicate ideas of race and class, as the icon reveals that in America, class plays as much of a role in prejudice and discrimination as various other ethnic characteristics. Racism in America is a complex issue that comes in a variety of forms. It would seem that the boundaries of the term racism have been blurred, as Americans now arguably consider class to be a contributing factor when determining someone's race, as is demonstrated successfully by the white middle class, as they have socially constructed the idea of the hillbilly. Arguably, if a certain group is foreseen to fail to encompass what American identity stands for, they subsequently fall victim to prejudice. For example, the term hillbilly is closely associated with other derogatory terms such as white trash, trailer trash, and redneck. The fact that all these terms are considered to be racial slurs gives us the impression that the hillbillies are in turn considered by a wider society to be a race of their own. The main culprit for hillbillies being negatively categorized into their own race has been the American media and television. For instance, the hit American TV show Here Comes Honey Boo Boo portrays the hillbilly to be clumsy, uneducated, and distant from the rest of society. However, most importantly, the show is created for comedy value, which only further emphasizes the class divide between them and the middle class audience. Furthermore, the show is making an example of the hillbilly, again because they aren't perceived to fit the mold for American identity, which supposedly justifies their negative portrayal. The egocentric society that exists in America makes it easy for minority groups such as hillbillies to be exploited. Arguably, modern society thrives off exploitation of others. Middle-class whites have singled out hillbillies in order to create a hierarchical white-class system. However, because most oppression of hillbillies is at the hands of middle-class whites, it has almost become socially acceptable to be condescending towards them, as it's not considered racist if a minority group is suffering oppression from their own race. This concept is argued by Freud in Civilization and Its Discontent, as he expresses the fact that the idea behind society is to bind people together. However, this can be seen as counterproductive due to the selfishness of humans. Thus, society ultimately leads to exploitation of others. In addition, the definition of the term others has been stretched beyond other races to include class, again reinforcing the blurred racial boundaries. It has been argued that the hillbillies possess similar values that the founding fathers founded the nation on. The tendencies and connotations surrounding these values have been distorted and manipulated by the ruling class in order to negatively categorize the hillbilly. For example, they are seen to uphold strong family traditions. These strong family bonds are associated with such things as inbreeding and mutation, which furthers the impression of hillbillies as it suggests dehumanization. Hillbillies are also perceived to be foragers of the land, which gives them a savage, animalistic undertone. This results in their oppression being more justifiable because they are not considered human, like the rest of society. It is important to identify whiteness as not just an objective colour, but to go further to classify historical connotations that come with it. Thus, if one would look at the Enlightenment period, the stereotypical association between whiteness and the Progressive era once again comes into the conflict with the hillbilly image. From the development of industrialization and urbanization, and thus the Enlightenment phase, the hillbillies have been criticized for their rejection of the movement and thus been portrayed as socially backward and primitive. Much of Freud's focus in his Civilization essay is based around sexual desires. He argues that civilization removes sexual energy by regulating it into cultural endeavors and taboos such as incest. From these imposed cultural restrictions to one's sex drive, it has meant that the egos and superegos can regulate desire in the same way as aggression should be ordered. If these were not controlled, which white mountaineers are labelled to be associated with, it would destroy a stable relationship because a white affluent society teaches that one must build a friendship bond first, before love. Ultimately, the assumptions of incest have come from this idea that the mountaineer families in the South are socially and geographically remote from the rest of society, and thus their stereotypical lack of intellect has given people the belief to argue that there is no cultural restrictions to their sex drive. William Matthew McCarter, in his book Homo Redneckus, looks deeply into his roots from the South and is offended with the derogatory terms of the Southern working class. He simply looks at the word trash to mean something that is broken or unable to fulfill its function. Therefore, the phrase white trash paints a literal picture of someone who cannot live up to the identity and history of the race as opposed to others. He notably points out that working class men and women in society that abide by white ruling class laws are known as hard-working citizens, but once they exhibit any kind of resistance such as striking, they would instantly be labelled as rednecks and hillbillies by society. However, the negative perceptions of working class mountaineers in the South has certainly not dampened the pride that these so-called socially backward group have. Terms such as redneck princess reveal a sense of pleasure in their race and class, even though they may be supposedly not fulfilling the traditional white image mentioned. Elvis Presley, an icon for the working class South, has been labelled as a redneck, but despite his famous extravagance and excess in consumption being related with the white trash image, he was proud of his roots, despite becoming wealthy and affluent. Elvis is therefore a great example of someone who achieved classic success by a white person, and although his extravagance may appear to be aspiring to middle and upper class, the working class pride was always there to see. Overall, The hillbilly most certainly complicates the idea of race and class identity in America. Given that America had no class character to begin with, such as a monarchy, reveals more largely that the traditional white ruling class have established that the American identity is based on affluence, and for those who do not share the same aspiration of wealth, regardless of race, will be repressed.